In the middle of the 19th century, when the United States was still a young and rapidly growing nation, night was a powerful limitation. When the sun went down, most of the world simply stopped. Homes were lit by candles or oil lamps that flickered weakly, filled rooms with smoke, and posed constant fire hazards. Factories slowed or shut down after dark. Streets were dangerous and dim. Productivity, safety, and daily life were all ruled by the rising and setting of the sun. No one at the time could fully imagine a world where darkness itself would be conquered, but that world would begin to take shape because of one man's obsession with light, Thomas Alva Edison. Born in 1847 in Milan, Ohio, Edison grew up during a period of massive transformation in America. Railroads were expanding, telegraphs were shrinking distances, and industry was reshaping the nation. Edison was not a brilliant student in the traditional sense. He received very little formal schooling and was largely self-educated. As a child, he was endlessly curious, constantly experimenting, asking questions, and taking things apart to understand how they worked. By his early 20s, Edison was already an experienced inventor and entrepreneur. He worked as a telegraph operator and had patented improvements to telegraph systems. But Edison wasn't interested in small improvements alone. He wanted to change how people lived. He once famously said that his goal was to invent things that people didn't yet realize they needed, but would soon be unable to live without. In the 1870s, artificial lighting was one of the biggest unsolved problems of modern life. Gas lighting existed in some cities, but it was expensive, dangerous, and required massive infrastructure. Gas leaks caused explosions, fires were common, and the light itself was harsh and uneven. Arc lighting, another early electric solution, was extremely bright but impractical for homes. It worked for large spaces like streets or factories, but it was too powerful, too expensive, and too complex for everyday use. Edison saw the opportunity clearly. If he could create a safe, affordable, long-lasting electric light for homes and businesses, it would transform society. Not just lighting, but work, education, industry, and culture itself. The idea of an electric bulb was not entirely new. Other inventors in Europe and America had experimented with incandescent lighting before Edison, but their bulbs burned out quickly, used too much power, or were too costly to be practical. Edison understood that the real challenge was not just inventing a bulb, it was creating an entire system that could support electric lighting on a large scale. In 1878, Edison publicly announced that he was working on a practical incandescent light. Many experts laughed at him. Some called it impossible. Others claimed it would never compete with gas lighting. Newspapers mocked his confidence, but Edison was undeterred. At his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, often called America's first true research lab, Edison and his team began years of relentless experimentation. They tested thousands of materials for filaments, the thin wire inside a bulb that glows when electricity passes through it. Platinum, carbonized paper, bamboo, cotton thread, nothing was off the table. Edison's process was famously exhausting. He and his assistants worked night and day, often sleeping in the lab. Failures piled up, bulbs shattered, filaments burned out, costs soared. When asked about his many failures, Edison reportedly replied, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Finally, in October 1879, Edison achieved a breakthrough. Using a carbonized filament and a vacuum-sealed glass bulb, he created a light that could glow for over 40 hours. Soon after, he improved it even further. For the first time in history, electric light was stable, reliable, and potentially affordable. But Edison knew that inventing the bulb was only the beginning. A light bulb without electricity was useless, so Edison set out to build an entire electrical system, from generators to wiring to switches that could deliver power safely into homes and businesses. This was a revolutionary idea. Instead of lighting being an isolated product, Edison envisioned electricity as a service. In 1882, Edison's vision became reality in Lower Manhattan. The Pearl Street Power Station began supplying electricity to hundreds of customers. For the first time, American homes and offices could flip a switch and instantly turn night into day. The impact was immediate and profound. Factories no longer depended on daylight. Workdays extended, productivity increased, and industrial output surged. Cities became brighter and safer at night. Street lighting reduced crime and accidents. Businesses stayed open longer. Newspapers could be printed late into the night. Hospitals could operate more effectively. Students could study after sunset. The light bulb changed how Americans used time itself. Before electric light, most people lived by a natural rhythm dictated by the sun. After Edison's invention, time was flexible. Night became usable. This shift reshaped modern life in ways that are difficult to fully measure. Electric lighting also accelerated urbanization. Cities grew rapidly as people were drawn to illuminated streets, factories, and opportunities. Skyscrapers became possible because buildings could be safely lit from top to bottom. Entertainment flourished. Nightlife, theaters, sports events, and eventually cinemas all depended on reliable lighting. Edison's work also ignited fierce competition. The so-called war of currents emerged between Edison's direct current (DC) system and alternating current (AC) system, promoted by Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse. While AC eventually became the dominant system due to its efficiency over long distances, Edison's role in establishing electrical infrastructure was undeniable. Without his early systems, the electrical age may have been delayed by decades. The light bulb also sparked a chain reaction of innovation. Once electricity entered homes, inventors rushed to create devices that could use it. Electric fans, refrigerators, washing machines, radios, and eventually televisions all followed. The modern electric grid became the backbone of American life. Entire industries were born because the light bulb made widespread electricity practical and necessary. Education changed as well. Schools extended hours. Libraries stayed open late. Literacy rates improved as reading became easier and more accessible at night. Knowledge itself spread faster in a well-lit world. The cultural impact was equally powerful. Light reshaped art, architecture, photography, and film. It changed how people gathered, how they socialized, and how they experienced public spaces. Cities like New York became symbols of progress, glowing landmarks of human achievement. Thomas Edison did not invent light itself, but he made it usable, controllable, and universal. By doing so, he helped turn America into a modern, industrialized nation and influenced nearly every developed country that followed. By the time of his death in 1931, Edison held over 1,000 patents, yet his light bulb remained his most iconic achievement, not because it was his only invention, but because it touched every aspect of human life. Today, when we flip a switch without thinking, we are participating in a legacy that began more than a century ago. Our cities never sleep. Our homes are bright at any hour. Our world runs on electricity, and it all traces back to that moment when darkness was no longer absolute. Thomas Edison once said, "The value of an idea lies in the using of it." His light bulb was not just an idea, it was a turning point in human history. It changed how Americans worked, learned, built, and dreamed. It transformed night into opportunity, and it proved that innovation, persistence, and belief in the impossible could quite literally light up the world. In the mid-20th century, few places on Earth were as ripe for transformation as California. Post-war America was booming, technology was advancing rapidly, and a new generation was growing up believing that innovation could change the world. Out of this environment came a young man who would help redefine not only American technology, but modern life itself. His name was Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 in San Francisco and adopted shortly after birth by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple living in California's Santa Clara Valley, an area that would later be known as Silicon Valley. His father, Paul, was a machinist who loved working with his hands. He taught young Steve how to take things apart and put them back together, always emphasizing that even unseen parts should be crafted with care. That lesson would later become a core philosophy behind Apple products. Jobs was intelligent, curious, and rebellious. He struggled in traditional classrooms and often clashed with authority, but he was deeply interested in electronics, design, and ideas that challenged the status quo. After high school, he enrolled at Reed College in Oregon, but dropped out after just one semester. Still, he continued to audit classes that interested him, including a calligraphy course, an experience that would later influence Apple's focus on typography and design. In the early 1970s, Jobs returned to California and took a job at Atari, a pioneering video game company. Around the same time, he reconnected with an old friend, Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was a brilliant engineer, quiet, modest, and obsessed with electronics. Where Jobs was a visionary and marketer, Wozniak was a pure inventor. Together, they formed a partnership that would change history. Wozniak had built a simple personal computer for fun using inexpensive parts. At the time, computers were massive, expensive machines owned only by corporations and universities. The idea that individuals could own a computer was radical. Jobs immediately saw the potential. He believed that computers should be personal, accessible, and easy to use, not just tools for experts. In 1976, working out of the Jobs family garage in Los Altos, California, the two Steves, along with a third, lesser-known partner named Ronald Wayne, founded Apple Computer Company. Their first product, the Apple I, was essentially a circuit board sold to hobbyists. It wasn't polished, but it worked. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van, and Wozniak sold his calculator to raise startup money. The Apple I was followed by the Apple II, released in 1977. This was a breakthrough. Unlike other computers of the time, the Apple II came fully assembled, had color graphics, and was designed for ordinary people. It became one of the first mass-market personal computers and a massive commercial success. Apple grew rapidly. Venture capital poured in. By 1980, Apple went public, creating instant millionaires and turning Steve Jobs, still in his mid-20s, into one of the youngest wealthy entrepreneurs in America. But success did not make Steve comfortable. He was driven by perfection, often demanding the impossible from his teams. He believed that technology and art should be inseparable. In 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh. Introduced with the now legendary Super Bowl commercial, the Mac promised to challenge corporate conformity and empower individuals. It featured a graphical user interface, a mouse, and a focus on simplicity, ideas inspired in part by research at Xerox PARC. While revolutionary, the Macintosh initially struggled commercially due to its high price and limited software. Behind the scenes, tensions inside Apple were growing. Steve's intense management style led to conflicts with employees and executives. In 1985, after a power struggle with CEO John Sculley, whom Steve Jobs himself had recruited, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he co-founded. For many, this would have been the end of the story, but for Steve Jobs, it was the beginning of something far greater. After leaving Apple, Jobs founded a new company called Next. His goal was to build powerful computers for education and business. Next computers were beautifully designed and technologically advanced, but they were expensive and failed to gain widespread adoption. Commercially, Next struggled, but technologically, it laid the groundwork for the future. The operating system developed at Next would later become the foundation of macOS and iOS. At the same time, Jobs made another bold move. In 1986, he purchased a small computer graphics division from Lucasfilm. He renamed it Pixar. At first, Pixar struggled financially, but Jobs believed in its potential. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a massive success, transforming animation forever and making Jobs a billionaire once again. Meanwhile, Apple was declining. By the mid-1990s, the company was losing money, lacked innovation, and was close to bankruptcy. In 1996, Apple made a decision that would change everything. It acquired Next, and with it, Steve Jobs. Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, initially as an advisor, then as interim CEO. One of his first actions was to simplify Apple's product line. He eliminated dozens of confusing products and focused the company on just a few core devices. He also launched the famous Think Different campaign, reconnecting Apple to its identity as a company for creators, innovators, and rebels. Behind the scenes, tensions inside Apple were growing. Steve's intense management style led to conflicts with employees and executives. In 1985, after a power struggle with CEO John Sculley, whom Steve Jobs himself had recruited, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he co-founded. For many, this would have been the end of the story, but for Steve Jobs, it was the beginning of something far greater. After leaving Apple, Jobs founded a new company called Next. His goal was to build powerful computers for education and business. Next computers were beautifully designed and technologically advanced, but they were expensive and failed to gain widespread adoption. Commercially, Next struggled, but technologically it laid the groundwork for the future. The operating system developed at Next would later become the foundation of macOS and iOS. At the same time, Jobs made another bold move. In 1986, he purchased a small computer graphics division from Lucasfilm. He renamed it Pixar. At first, Pixar struggled financially, but Jobs believed in its potential. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a massive success, transforming animation forever and making Jobs a billionaire once again. Meanwhile, Apple was declining. By the mid-1990s, the company was losing money, lacked innovation, and was close to bankruptcy. In 1996, Apple made a decision that would change everything. It acquired Next, and with it, Steve Jobs. Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, initially as an advisor, then as interim CEO. One of his first actions was to simplify Apple's product line. He eliminated dozens of confusing products and focused the company on just a few core devices. He also launched the famous Think Different campaign, reconnecting Apple to its identity as a company for creators, innovators, and rebels. Behind the scenes, tensions inside Apple were growing. Steve's intense management style led to conflicts with employees and executives. In 1985, after a power struggle with CEO John Sculley, whom Steve Jobs himself had recruited, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he co-founded. For many, this would have been the end of the story, but for Steve Jobs, it was the beginning of something far greater. After leaving Apple, Jobs founded a new company called Next. His goal was to build powerful computers for education and business. Next computers were beautifully designed and technologically advanced, but they were expensive and failed to gain widespread adoption. Commercially, Next struggled, but technologically it laid the groundwork for the future. The operating system developed at Next would later become the foundation of macOS and iOS. At the same time, Jobs made another bold move. In 1986, he purchased a small computer graphics division from Lucasfilm. He renamed it Pixar. At first, Pixar struggled financially, but Jobs believed in its potential. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a massive success, transforming animation forever and making Jobs a billionaire once again. Meanwhile, Apple was declining. By the mid-1990s, the company was losing money, lacked innovation, and was close to bankruptcy. In 1996, Apple made a decision that would change everything. It acquired Next, and with it, Steve Jobs. Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, initially as an advisor, then as interim CEO. One of his first actions was to simplify Apple's product line. He eliminated dozens of confusing products and focused the company on just a few core devices. He also launched the famous Think Different campaign, reconnecting Apple to its identity as a company for creators, innovators, and rebels. Behind the scenes, tensions inside Apple were growing. Steve's intense management style led to conflicts with employees and executives. In 1985, after a power struggle with CEO John Sculley, whom Steve Jobs himself had recruited, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he co-founded. For many, this would have been the end of the story, but for Steve Jobs, it was the beginning of something far greater. After leaving Apple, Jobs founded a new company called Next. His goal was to build powerful computers for education and business. Next computers. At the dawn of the 20th century, humanity stood on the edge of a dream that had existed for thousands of years. From the myths of Icarus to the sketches of Leonardo da Vinci, people had always imagined what it might be like to fly like birds. But imagination alone had never been enough. Every serious attempt at powered flight had ended the same way, with failure, injury, or death. To most experts of the time, human flight was either impossible or so dangerous that it was not worth pursuing. Newspapers dismissed it as fantasy. Scientists debated it endlessly. Governments ignored it. And yet, in a quiet bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, two American brothers were about to prove the world wrong. Wilbur and Orville Wright were not wealthy. They were not college professors or famous engineers. They had no government funding, no powerful sponsors, and no advanced laboratories. What they had was curiosity, discipline, and an unshakable belief that the problem of flight could be solved, not by brute force, but by understanding. The Wright brothers were born into a middle-class American family in the late 19th century. Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop who valued education and intellectual debate. Their mother, Susan Wright, was mechanically inclined and encouraged her children to experiment. From an early age, Wilbur and Orville showed a fascination with machines, motion, and problem solving. As teenagers, they became deeply interested in bicycles, which were rapidly growing in popularity across the United States. They opened a bicycle repair and manufacturing shop, learning firsthand about balance, control, lightweight structures, and mechanical efficiency. These lessons would later become critical to their success in aviation. In the 1890s, news of glider experiments by European inventors began circulating in America. One name stood out: Otto Lilienthal, a German aviation pioneer who had successfully flown gliders before dying in a crash in 1896. His death deeply affected Wilbur Wright. Instead of discouraging him, it convinced him that flight was possible, but not yet understood. The Wright brothers began studying everything they could about flight. They read scientific papers, analyzed failed experiments, and corresponded with experts at the Smithsonian Institution. But soon they noticed a problem. Much of the existing data on aerodynamics was wrong. Rather than accept the errors of others, the brothers decided to start from scratch. They believed that the key to flight was not power alone, but control. Birds did not simply flap their wings, they adjusted them constantly. The Wright brothers hypothesized that a successful flying machine must be controllable in all three axes: pitch, roll, and yaw. This insight would change everything. Between 1909 and 1902, the Wright brothers built and tested a series of gliders. They chose Kitty Hawk, North Carolina as their testing ground because of its steady winds, soft sand for crashes, and isolation from crowds. There, they spent years flying unpowered gliders, crashing, repairing, and refining their designs. Progress was slow and exhausting. Many of their early gliders failed to perform as expected. Lift was weaker than predicted, control was unstable. But instead of giving up, the brothers questioned the science itself. Back in Dayton, they built a small wind tunnel, the first of its kind used for aviation research. Using hundreds of miniature wing shapes, they gathered precise data on lift and drag. This homemade experiment produced more accurate results than anything available at the time. With new data in hand, the Wright brothers redesigned their wings, perfected their control system using wing warping, and prepared for the final challenge: powered flight. No existing engine met their needs. It had to be lightweight yet powerful, so they built their own with the help of their mechanic, Charlie Taylor. The engine produced about 12 horsepower, just enough. By late 1903, their flying machine, the Wright Flyer, was ready. It was a fragile-looking structure of wood, fabric, wires, and a homemade engine. To most observers, it looked more like a kite than a revolutionary invention. On December 17th, in the cold winds of Kitty Hawk, history was made. After a coin toss, Orville Wright took the controls. The Flyer lifted off the ground and stayed airborne for 12 seconds, traveling 120 feet. It was the first controlled, sustained, powered flight of a heavier-than-air aircraft in human history. 3 more flights followed that day, the last lasting nearly a minute and covering over 800 feet. Wilbur piloted the final flight, proving that the achievement was not a fluke. The age of aviation had begun. At the time, almost no one noticed. The Wright brothers returned to Ohio quietly. Newspapers largely ignored the story. Some editors refused to believe the claims without photographs. Others dismissed it as exaggerated. Even the U.S. government showed little interest. But the Wright brothers kept working. Over the next several years, they improved their designs dramatically. By 1905, their aircraft could fly for more than 30 minutes, make controlled turns, and land safely. They now had a practical airplane, but convincing the world proved harder than inventing it. European governments showed more interest than America. Demonstrations in France stunned audiences. Pilots flew circles, figure eights, and long distances. Skeptics were silenced. Aviation was no longer theory, it was reality. Eventually, the United States took notice. The U.S. Army purchased its first airplane from the Wright brothers in 1909. Aviation schools followed, patents were filed. An entirely new industry began to form. What started with 2 brothers and a fragile machine soon reshaped warfare, transportation, commerce, and global culture. During World War I, airplanes evolved rapidly, from fragile scouts to fighters and bombers. By World War II, aviation had become a decisive force. Long-range bombers, aircraft carriers, and advanced navigation systems changed the outcome of global conflict. In peacetime, aviation transformed the world even more profoundly. Commercial airlines emerged, shrinking the planet. Trips that once took weeks by ship could now be completed in hours. Business expanded globally, tourism flourished, cultures connected. Modern aviation led directly to innovations in engineering, material science, meteorology, and navigation. Radar, jet engines, air traffic control, and eventually space exploration all trace their roots back to that first flight at Kitty Hawk. The Wright brothers themselves remained modest figures. They did not seek fame for its own sake. Wilbur died in 1912 at just 45 years old. Orville lived until 1948, witnessing aviation advance from wooden flyers to jet aircraft. Today, every airplane, commercial jet, military fighter, cargo plane, or private aircraft operates on principles the Wright brothers proved over a century ago. Control surfaces, lift equations, pilot command, stability in flight. Modern aviation did not emerge overnight, but it began with one moment, one machine, and 2 Americans who refused to accept that something was impossible. The Wright brothers did not just invent an airplane, they unlocked the sky. They changed how nations defend themselves, how economies function, and how people experience distance. They transformed the world into a connected place where continents are hours apart and the sky is no longer a barrier, but a highway. And it all began on a cold December morning when 2 brothers from Ohio proved that human beings were finally meant to fly. For most of human history, communication moved at the speed of a person, a horse, or a ship. News took weeks or months to travel. Ideas spread slowly. Distance was a powerful barrier that shaped politics, economies, wars, and daily life. Even in the 20th century, Despite telephones, radio, and television, communication was still limited, centralized, and controlled by institutions. Then, quietly and almost accidentally, the United States gave birth to something that would erase distance itself. The internet did not begin as a social network, a business tool, or a form of entertainment. It began as a Cold War experiment, one rooted in fear, survival, and American innovation. The story starts in the late 1950s, at the height of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1957, the Soviet launch of Sputnik shocked America. The idea that a rival nation could dominate space and potentially military technology triggered deep concern in Washington. In response, the U.S. government created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, later known as DARPA. Its mission was simple but ambitious: prevent technological surprise by ensuring the United States stayed ahead in science and innovation. One of ARPA's biggest concerns was communication. At the time, American military and government communication systems were centralized and fragile. If a major attack destroyed a command center, communication could collapse entirely. Researchers began asking a radical question. What if information could travel through multiple paths instead of one? What if a network could survive even if parts of it were destroyed? This question would lead to the birth of the internet. In the early 1960s, a visionary psychologist and computer scientist named J.C.R. Licklider began promoting a revolutionary idea. He imagined a galactic network where computers around the world could connect, share information, and allow humans to collaborate instantly. At the time, computers were massive machines used mainly for calculations, not communication. Licklider's idea sounded almost like science fiction, but ARPA listened. By the mid-1960s, ARPA funded research into computer networking. One of the most important breakthroughs was the concept of packet switching, developed independently by American engineer Paul Baran and British scientist Donald Davies. Instead of sending information as a single continuous stream, data could be broken into small packets, sent independently across a network, and reassembled at the destination. This made communication faster, more efficient, and, most importantly, resilient. In 1969, ARPANET launched ARPANET, the direct ancestor of today's internet. The first 4 nodes were connected at American universities: UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. These institutions represented the cutting edge of U.S. research. The first message ever sent over ARPANET was meant to be the word login. The system crashed after the first 2 letters. The message received was simply LO. It was a small, almost unremarkable moment, but it marked the first time in history that computers communicated over a long-distance digital network. Throughout the 1970s, ARPANET expanded across the United States. Researchers used it to share data, send messages, and collaborate remotely. One unexpected innovation quickly became the network's most popular feature: email. By the mid-1970s, email accounted for the majority of ARPANET traffic. Human communication was already beginning to change. But ARPANET was still limited. It connected one network, but what if many networks could connect together? This challenge led to another American breakthrough. In the 1970s, computer scientists Vint Cerf and Con Kahn developed a new communication standard called TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol. This system allowed different networks to connect and communicate as one unified network of networks. On January 1st, 1983, ARPANET officially transitions to TCP/IP. This date is often considered the true birth of the internet. Still, the internet remained mostly invisible to the public. It was used by researchers, universities, and government agencies. There were no websites, no browsers, no search engines. To use the internet, you needed technical knowledge and access to specialized systems. That would soon change. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, another transformative idea emerged, not in America, but at CERN in Europe. British scientist Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, a system that used hyperlinks, web pages, and browsers to make the internet easy to navigate. But it was the United States that turned the web into a global phenomenon. In 1993, American researchers at the University of Illinois released Mosaic, the first widely used graphical web browser. Suddenly, the internet was no longer just text. It was visual, clickable, and accessible to ordinary people. That moment changed everything. By the mid-1990s, the US government opened the internet to commercial use. Private companies rushed in. Internet service providers emerged. Startups were born overnight. What followed was one of the most explosive periods of innovation in American history. Companies like Amazon, Yahoo, and eBay appeared, redefining shopping, information, and commerce. Google transformed how humans find knowledge. Email replaced letters. Instant messaging replaced waiting. Websites replaced encyclopedias. Human communication entered a new era. Before the internet, communication was mostly one way. Television broadcasted, newspapers published, radio spoke. The internet made communication interactive, global, and immediate. Anyone with a connection could publish ideas, share opinions, and reach an audience. Social media would later amplify this transformation. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube reshaped politics, culture, and identity. Voices once unheard could now be amplified. Movements could organize in real time. News could spread instantly, for better and for worse. The American-built internet erased borders in ways no invention ever had. Families separated by continents could communicate instantly. Businesses could operate globally. Education expanded beyond classrooms. Entire careers were born online. The gig economy, remote work, and digital entrepreneurship all grew from this foundation. The internet also transformed warfare, intelligence, and national security. Cyber defense became as important as physical defense. Information itself became a strategic asset. Yet, despite its flaws, the internet remains one of the most powerful tools ever created. It changed how humans think, learn, remember, and relate to one another. It compressed time and space. It blurred the line between local and global. It turned information into the most valuable resource on Earth. And it all began in America, not as a consumer product, but as a research project driven by curiosity, fear, and imagination. The engineers who built the internet did not fully predict its impact. They did not imagine social media influencers, online revolutions, or digital economies worth trillions of dollars. They simply wanted computers to talk to one another. But when computers learned to communicate, humanity followed. Today, nearly every moment of modern life depends on the internet. Banking, medicine, transportation, entertainment, education, and communication all rely on a system that began with a few connected machines in American universities. The internet did not just change communication, it changed civilization. It reshaped how ideas spread, how power is challenged, how relationships form, and how history unfolds in real time. It gave humanity a shared digital space, one that continues to evolve, disrupt, and redefine the future. And as long as humans seek to connect, share, and be heard, the story of the internet, born in America, will remain one of the most important stories ever told. In the late 19th century, the United States stood on the edge of a technological revolution. Cities were growing, factories were expanding, and America was transforming into an industrial powerhouse. But one force still held humanity back more than any other: darkness. The question was no longer whether electricity would shape the future, but how it would be delivered to the world. At the center of this struggle stood two of the most brilliant and most different minds in history: Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. Their rivalry would decide how electricity powered homes, cities, and nations. It would shape the modern world in ways that still affect every light switch, power outlet, and electrical grid today. This was not just a clash of technologies, it was a clash of philosophies, personalities, and visions of the future. Thomas Edison was already a living legend in America. Born in Ohio in 1847, Edison was the embodiment of the American inventor-entrepreneur. He was practical, relentless, and business-minded. With little formal education, he rose through sheer persistence, experimentation, and an unmatched ability to turn ideas into commercial success. By the late 1870s, Edison had already invented or improved the phonograph, telegraph systems, and, most famously, the practical incandescent light bulb. He founded laboratories, employed teams of engineers, and built companies that would later become part of General Electric. To the American public, Edison was the Wizard of Menlo Park, a symbol of progress and ingenuity. Nikola Tesla could not have been more different. Born in 1856 in what is now Croatia, Tesla was a visionary genius with a photographic memory and an almost supernatural ability to imagine machines in perfect detail. He spoke multiple languages, performed complex calculations in his head, and claimed that inventions came to him fully formed in flashes of insight. Tesla was not driven by profit. He was driven by ideas, by the dream of limitless energy, wireless power, and a future where electricity served all of humanity freely. But Tesla struggled with business, politics, and self-promotion. In America's capitalist system, that weakness would prove costly. Their paths crossed in the early 1880s. Tesla arrived in the United States in 1884 with little money and a letter of recommendation addressed to Thomas Edison. At the time, Edison was building direct current, or DC, electrical systems across American cities. Tesla was hired to work for Edison, tasked with improving DC generators. Tesla quickly realized the limitations of Edison's system. Direct current could only travel short distances and required power stations every mile or so. It was inefficient, expensive, and impractical for a growing nation. Tesla believed the future belonged to alternating current, or AC, a system where electricity periodically reverses direction. AC could travel long distances at high voltages and be stepped down safely for use in homes. It was cheaper, more efficient, and scalable. Edison disagreed. Edison had already invested heavily in DC infrastructure. His company's patents and reputation were built around DC. To Edison, DC wasn't just a technology, it was his empire. When Tesla proposed redesigning Edison's systems, conflict followed. Tesla later claimed Edison promised him a large bonus for improving DC generators, a promise Edison allegedly dismissed as a joke. Whether true or not, the partnership collapsed. Tesla quit, broke and disillusioned. For a time, Tesla worked menial labor jobs just to survive. But Tesla's ideas did not die. In 1887, Tesla found backing from investors and began developing alternating current motors and transformers. His work attracted the attention of George Westinghouse, a powerful American industrialist who recognized the potential of AC power. Westinghouse bought Tesla's patents and hired him as a consultant. This alliance changed everything. What followed became known as the War of Currents, one of the most intense technological battles in American history. On one side stood Edison, defending DC. On the other stood Tesla and Westinghouse, promoting AC. Edison launched a fierce public campaign against AC. He claimed it was dangerous, unpredictable, and deadly. To prove his point, Edison's associates publicly electrocuted animals using AC power, including dogs, calves, and even an elephant. These demonstrations horrified the public, but successfully planted fear. Edison also supported the development of the electric chair, ensuring it ran on AC power, hoping to associate AC with death in the public mind. Tesla fought back with science and demonstrations. He allowed AC electricity to pass harmlessly through his own body, lighting lamps in his hands to prove it could be safe. He explained that voltage alone was not deadly. Current and exposure mattered. The battle was not just technical, it was political, financial, and emotional.
The turning point came in the early 1990s. In 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition, a massive event celebrating American progress. The contract to light the fair was awarded to Westinghouse, using Tesla's AC system. Millions of visitors witnessed buildings illuminated brilliantly and safely by alternating current. The spectacle was undeniable. Shortly after, AC power was chosen for one of the greatest engineering projects of the era, Niagara Falls. Tesla's system was used to transmit electricity from the falls to Buffalo, New York, over 20 miles away. It was proof that AC could power entire regions. The war of currents was effectively over. Alternating current became the standard electrical system in the United States and eventually the world. Today, nearly all power grids operate on Tesla's principles. Edison lost the battle, but not his legacy. Edison continued inventing, founding companies, and shaping American industry. He remained a symbol of applied innovation and entrepreneurship. Tesla, meanwhile, continued working on bold ideas, wireless power transmission, radio waves, and even concepts resembling modern radar and remote control. But Tesla's life took a tragic turn. He struggled financially, gave away valuable patent rights, and became increasingly isolated. Many of his later ideas were ahead of the technology of his time, and sometimes misunderstood or dismissed. He died alone in a New York hotel room in 1943, nearly forgotten by the public. History, however, would remember him. Today, Tesla is recognized as one of the greatest inventors who ever lived. His work underpins modern electricity, radio communication, and electrical engineering. His name now powers a new generation of innovation. The rivalry between Tesla and Edison was never truly personal. It was ideological. Edison believed progress came through trial, error, and business execution. Tesla believed it came through vision, theory, and imagination. Both were right, and both were necessary. Together, through conflict, they shaped the modern world. Every time a city lights up at night, every time electricity travels hundreds of miles to power homes, every time modern civilization runs smoothly in the background, the legacy of this rivalry lives on. It was a battle of currents, but also a battle of ideas. And in the end, humanity won.
For most of human history, communication was slow, fragile, and limited by distance. A message could travel only as fast as a person could walk, ride, or sail. Even in the 19th century, when America was expanding rapidly and industry was booming, communication still depended on physical movement. Letters took days or weeks. News arrived late. Decisions were delayed. Distance shaped everything. Then came a single invention that collapsed distance into sound. The telephone did not just improve communication, it transformed civilization. And at the center of that transformation stood a man whose work would forever change how humans connect, Alexander Graham Bell. Bell's story begins long before the first phone call. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, into a family obsessed with sound. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was an expert in elocution and speech and developed a system called visible speech to help deaf individuals learn to speak. Bell's mother was deaf, and from an early age, young Alexander learned to communicate with her through vibration and visual cues. This upbringing shaped Bell's life. Sound was not just noise to him, it was a science, a mystery, and a mission. In the 1870s, Bell immigrated to the United States, settling first in Boston. America at the time was a nation in motion. Railroads stretched across the continent, factories hummed, cities grew louder and more crowded. The telegraph had already revolutionized long-distance communication by sending coded electrical signals over wires. But the telegraph had limits. Messages had to be translated into Morse code and decoded at the other end. It was efficient, but impersonal. Bell dreamed of something more human. He believed the human voice itself could be transmitted electrically. Many scientists doubted this was possible.
The idea that complex sound waves, tone, pitch, emotion, could be converted into electrical signals and reconstructed miles away seemed unrealistic. But Bell's deep understanding of sound mechanics gave him confidence. While working as a teacher for the deaf in Boston, Bell conducted experiments in his spare time. He worked with a young machinist named Thomas Watson, whose technical skill complemented Bell's theoretical mind. Together, they began experimenting with ways to transmit sound through wires. At first, Bell was not trying to invent the telephone. His original goal was to improve the telegraph, to create a harmonic telegraph that could send multiple messages simultaneously over a single wire. But in pursuing this idea, he stumbled onto something far more revolutionary. Bell realized that if electrical currents could vary continuously rather than switching on and off like Morse code, they could mimic the vibrations of sound waves. If those vibrations could be captured at one end and recreated at the other, speech itself could travel through wires. It was a radical idea. The race to make it real was intense. Bell was not the only inventor working on voice transmission. Others, including Elisha Gray, were pursuing similar concepts. The competition would become one of the most famous patent battles in American history. On February 14, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell filed a patent application for his improvement in telegraphy. On the same day, Elisha Gray submitted a similar idea, but Bell's application reached the patent office first. That single timing difference would change history. Just weeks later, on March 10, 1876, the world changed forever. In a small laboratory in Boston, Bell accidentally spilled acid on himself and called out, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." To Elisha's astonishment, Watson heard the words clearly, not through the air, but through a wire. It was the first successful transmission of intelligible human speech. The telephone was born. At first, few people understood the invention's significance. Some dismissed it as a novelty. Others thought it had no practical value beyond short distances. Even Western Union, the dominant telegraph company in America, initially rejected the telephone, calling it a toy. They would soon regret that decision. Bell showcased the telephone at the 1876 Centennial International Exhibition in Philadelphia. Audiences were stunned. Voices traveled invisibly across rooms and buildings. Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil famously exclaimed, "My God, it talks!" Public fascination exploded. Bell quickly moved to protect his invention. In 1877, he co-founded the Bell Telephone Company, the foundation of what would eventually become AT&T, one of America's most powerful telecommunications giants. The early days of the telephone were challenging. There were no phone numbers, no switchboards, and no infrastructure. Telephones were sold in pairs, connecting only two locations. But demand grew rapidly. Operators, often young women, were hired to manually connect calls by plugging wires into switchboards. Cities began installing telephone lines. Businesses adopted phones to coordinate faster. Doctors used them for emergencies. Newspapers relied on them for breaking news. Communication was no longer delayed, it was immediate. The telephone reshaped American life. For the first time, people could hear the voices of loved ones across miles. Families stayed connected. Businesses expanded beyond local boundaries. Markets became faster and more efficient. Decision-making accelerated. Time seemed compressed. The telephone also changed social behavior. Conversations became more personal. News spread faster. Communities felt smaller. As the network expanded, innovation followed. Long-distance calling became possible. Telephone exchanges connected cities, then states. By the early 20th century, America was wired together by voice. Alexander Graham Bell did not stop inventing. He worked on aviation, hydrofoils, optical communication, and continued research in sound and speech. But his defining achievement remained the telephone. Ironically, Bell himself disliked using the telephone. He felt it interrupted work and distracted from thought. Yet his invention would become one of the most used technologies in human history. Over time, the telephone evolved. Rotary dials replaced operators, push-button phones followed, transistors replaced vacuum tubes, communication became cheaper, faster, and more reliable. International calls connected continents, satellites extended reach beyond cables. By the late 20th century, the telephone merged with computing. Mobile phones freed communication from wires. Smartphones turned the telephone into a pocket-sized computer, capable of text, images, video, and global connectivity. Every one of these advances traces back to Bell's original breakthrough, transmitting the human voice electrically. The telephone did not just connect individuals, it reshaped the global economy. It enabled modern business, emergency services, diplomacy, and international cooperation. It laid the foundation for the internet, mobile communication, and the digital age. Alexander Graham Bell died in 1922. On the day of his funeral, telephone services across the United States and Canada were silenced for 1 minute in his honor. Millions of phones fell quiet, a powerful symbol of the man who gave the world its voice. Today, it is almost impossible to imagine life without instant communication. We call across cities, countries, and oceans without a second thought. We video chat, send voice notes, and stay constantly connected. All of it began with one idea, that sound could travel through a wire. Bell did not just invent a machine, he changed how humans relate to one another. He erased distance, he turned voices into bridges. The telephone connected the world not with code, not with symbols, but with the most human thing of all, the sound of another person's voice. And in doing so, it changed history. At the turn of the 20th century, America was changing fast, but transportation was still stuck in the past. Most people traveled by foot, horse, or carriage. Automobiles existed, but they were rare, expensive, unreliable machines owned only by the wealthy. To the average American family, a car was not a necessity, it was an unreachable luxury. That reality would change because of one man's radical idea, not just about cars, but about how things should be made. His name was Henry Ford, and his assembly line would reshape not only the automobile industry, but everyday life in America and eventually the world. Henry Ford was born in 1863 on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan. From an early age, he showed little interest in farming. What fascinated him were machines. He took apart watches, repaired engines, and spent hours trying to understand how mechanical systems worked. His father hoped he would take over the family farm, but Ford was determined to follow a different path. As a young man, Ford moved to Detroit and worked as a machinist and engineer. In the 1990s, he became chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company. This job provided stability, but his real passion lay elsewhere. Ford was obsessed with the idea of a self-propelled vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine. In 1896, Ford built his first automobile, the quadricycle. It was crude, noisy, and slow, but it worked. Still, success did not come easily. Ford launched 2 automobile companies that failed before finally founding the Ford Motor Company in 1903. At the time, the auto industry was chaotic. Cars were handmade by skilled craftsmen, one at a time. Each vehicle was expensive, inconsistent, and slow to produce. A single car could take more than 12 hours to build. Prices were high and production numbers were low. Ford believed this system was wrong. He didn't want to build cars for the rich. He wanted to build cars for ordinary Americans, factory workers, farmers, shopkeepers. To do that, cars had to be affordable, reliable, and easy to maintain. That belief led to the creation of the Model T in 1908. The Model T was simple, durable, and designed for rough American roads. It used interchangeable parts, making repairs easier. It wasn't stylish or luxurious, but it worked. And Ford was convinced it could change America if he could find a way to build it cheaply and quickly. The challenge was production. Ford studied manufacturing processes obsessively. He analyzed slaughterhouses, grain mills, and factories anywhere materials moved efficiently. One idea kept coming back to him. Instead of workers moving around a product, what if the product moved past the workers? This idea would become the moving assembly line. In 1913, at Ford's Highland Park plant in Michigan, the world witnessed one of the most important industrial breakthroughs in history. Ford introduced a system where the Model T chassis moved along a conveyor while workers performed a single, repetitive task as it passed by. The impact was immediate and astonishing. Assembly time dropped from more than 12 hours to about 90 minutes. Production soared, costs plummeted. Ford could now build cars faster and cheaper than any competitor. And Ford did something revolutionary with those savings. He lowered the price of the Model T again and again. What once cost over $800 dropped to less than $300 within a few years. Suddenly, an automobile was within the reach of the average American family. But Ford understood something else. Mass production required stable workers. Factory work on the assembly line was exhausting and repetitive. Turnover was high. So in 1914, Ford shocked the business world by announcing a $5 a day wage, more than double the industry standard. He also reduced the workday to 8 hours. This decision made headlines across America. Critics said it was reckless, others called it brilliant. What it did was create a workforce that could afford the very cars they were building. Ford wasn't just producing automobiles, he was creating consumers. The assembly line did more than change factories. It reshaped American society. As cars became affordable, Americans gained unparalleled freedom of movement. People could live farther from work. Suburbs began to grow. Cities expanded outward. Rural communities became more connected. Roads were built. Highways followed. Gas stations, motels, diners, and repair shops sprang up across the country. Entire industries were born because of the automobile. Everyday life changed. Shopping habits shifted. Vacations became possible for working-class families. Emergency services improved. Mail delivery expanded. America became a nation on wheels. The assembly line itself spread far beyond automobiles. Other industries quickly adopted Ford's methods. Appliances, food, clothing, and household goods began to be mass-produced. Products became cheaper and more standardized. Consumer culture exploded. The modern middle class emerged alongside mass production. But Ford's system was not without criticism. Assembly line work was monotonous and physically demanding. Workers repeated the same motion thousands of times a day. Creativity was sacrificed for efficiency. Labor unions later pushed back, demanding better conditions and rights. Still, the impact was undeniable. By 1927, Ford had sold over 15 million Model Ts. America had been transformed. The automobile was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. Henry Ford himself was a complex figure. He was a visionary industrialist, but also deeply flawed. His views on labor, politics, and society were often controversial. Yet his influence on manufacturing and daily life remains unmatched. The assembly line became the foundation of modern industrial production. It influenced everything from aerospace to electronics, from fast food to smartphones. Even today, factories around the world operate on principles Ford helped popularize. More than a century later, when cars roll off production lines at incredible speeds, they follow a path first laid down in Ford's factories. Henry Ford once said, "If you think you can do a thing or think you can't do a thing, you're right." His belief in efficiency, scale, and accessibility reshaped the 20th century. He didn't just change how cars were made, he changed how people lived, worked, traveled, and dreamed. The assembly line turned machines into everyday tools. It turned time into productivity. It turned a nation into a mobile society. And it all began with one simple idea: move the work to the worker and let the world move forward. On a warm summer night in July 1969, millions of Americans sat glued to their television screens. Families crowded into living rooms, neighbors gathered around glowing black and white TVs, and an entire nation held its breath. On the screen was a grainy image, flickering, imperfect, almost unreal. Then a voice crackled through the static. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." In that moment, humanity crossed a boundary that had existed since the beginning of time. A human being had walked on the moon. And behind that single step stood one of the greatest achievements in American history, an achievement built not just on rockets and fuel, but on ideas, mathematics, code, and relentless innovation. The journey to the moon did not begin in space. It began on Earth decades earlier, in laboratories, universities, factories, and government offices across the United States. The roots of America's space program can be traced to the early 20th century, when rocketry was considered a fringe science. Visionaries like Robert H. Goddard, an American physicist, believed rockets could reach space long before governments took the idea seriously. In 1926, Goddard launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket in a Massachusetts field. It flew only 41 feet, but it proved a revolutionary concept. At the time, many dismissed Goddard as a dreamer. Newspapers mocked the idea of space travel. But Goddard persisted, developing guidance systems, fuel pumps, and stabilization methods that would later become essential to spaceflight. Quietly, America was laying the groundwork for the future. Then history intervened. After World War II, the global balance of power shifted. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rivals locked in ideological and technological competition. Rockets were no longer theoretical, they were weapons. Both sides raced to develop missile technology, drawing on wartime research and captured German engineers. In 1957, the world changed overnight. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. It was small, simple, and harmless, but its impact was enormous. For Americans, Sputnik was a shock. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch nuclear weapons. The fear was real, and it spread fast. America responded with urgency. In 1958, the United States created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Its mission was not just exploration, but national survival, technological leadership, and prestige. Space became a new frontier, and the stakes could not have been higher. The early years were difficult. Rockets exploded, capsules failed. Astronauts risked their lives on untested machines, but progress was rapid. The Mercury program put the first Americans into space. Alan Shepard and John Glenn became national heroes. America proved it could compete. Still, the Soviet Union remained ahead. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. Once again, America found itself second. The pressure mounted. The Cold War had moved beyond Earth. Just weeks later, President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress with a bold declaration. He did not promise an easy victory, he promised a difficult one. "We choose to go to the moon," Kennedy said, "not because it is easy, but because it is hard." With that speech, America committed itself to one of the most ambitious goals in human history, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade was over. This was not just a space mission, it was a national mobilization. The Apollo program brought together over 400,000 people, engineers, scientists, mathematicians, factory workers, technicians, and programmers. Universities trained new generations of specialists, industries retooled, entire cities revolved around space work. And at the heart of it all was something invisible, yet essential: code. The Apollo spacecraft required computers small enough to fit on board, powerful enough to guide a spacecraft through space, and reliable enough to never fail. At the time, computers filled entire rooms. No one had ever built anything like this before. At MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory, engineers developed the Apollo Guidance Computer. It had less computing power than a modern calculator, but it was revolutionary. It used integrated circuits, helping to accelerate the development of modern computing. It ran real-time software written by teams led by pioneers like Margaret Hamilton, whose work helped invent modern software engineering. These programs calculated trajectories, corrected errors, and guided astronauts hundreds of thousands of miles from Earth. When problems arose, the computer adopted. During the Apollo 11 landing, it famously prioritized tasks and kept running despite overload alarms, allowing the mission to succeed. Innovation extended far beyond computers. Engineers developed new materials to withstand heat and pressure. Navigation techniques were invented from scratch. Life support systems were designed to keep humans alive in the vacuum of space. Even basic questions, how to eat, sleep, or use tools in zero gravity, had to be answered. The Saturn V rocket, still the most powerful rocket ever flown, stood as a symbol of American engineering. Taller than the Statue of Liberty and generating more power than anything built before it, it was a controlled explosion aimed at the sky. But progress came at a cost. In 1967, tragedy struck during a ground test for Apollo 1. A cabin fire killed astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The nation mourned. The program paused. Investigations revealed design flaws and cultural problems. NASA changed its processes, placing safety and accountability above speed. The setback nearly derailed the moon goal, but instead it strengthened the program. Step by step, mission by mission, NASA advanced. Apollo 8 orbited the moon. Apollo 10 rehearsed the landing. Each success built confidence. Then came Apollo 11. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V lifted off from Cape Kennedy, carrying Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The launch was flawless. Days later, the lunar module separated and descended toward the moon's surface. The landing was tense. Fuel ran low. The computer issued alarms. Armstrong took manual control, guiding the craft to a safe landing site. When it touched down, he reported calmly, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Hours later, Armstrong stepped on the moon. Aldrin followed. Collins orbited above, alone but vital. The mission succeeded. America had done what seemed impossible. But the moon landing was not the end. It was the beginning. The technologies developed for Apollo reshaped life on Earth. Computers became smaller and more powerful. Material science advanced. Telecommunications improved. Medical monitoring systems evolved. Satellite technology expanded, enabling GPS, weather forecasting, and global communication. The space program inspired generations. Children who watched the moon landing became scientists, engineers, and innovators. American universities expanded STEM education. The idea that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle became part of the national identity. Later missions built space stations. Reusable spacecraft followed. Probes explored the solar system. Mars rovers roamed alien landscapes. Telescopes peered deep into the universe. All of it traces back to that era when America decided to aim higher than ever before. The moon landing was not just about beating the Soviet Union, it was about proving what a free society could accomplish when knowledge, creativity, and determination came together. It was built on code written line by line, equations solved by hand, risks taken by ordinary people doing extraordinary work. From the first rockets to the first lines of software, from Earth to the moon, American innovation rewrote what humanity believed was possible. Today, as new missions aim for the moon again and beyond to Mars, the legacy of that journey remains alive. The moon still hangs above us, unchanged, but we are not the same. because once, driven by curiosity and courage, America reached up and touched the sky.
In the early 1990s, the world of information was messy, sprawling, and nearly impossible to navigate. The internet was growing fast, but it was like a vast, uncharted library with no catalog. Websites existed, but finding them required skill, patience, or luck. Search engines of the time were primitive. They returned pages in random order, spammed results dominated, and relevant information was often buried beneath irrelevant links. It was in this environment that two young students at Stanford University began a project that would change how humanity interacts with knowledge. Their names were Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and their vision would give the world a tool more transformative than any encyclopedia ever printed. Larry Page, born in 1973 in East Lansing, Michigan, grew up in a family of academics. His father was a computer science pioneer, and his mother a mathematics educator. From a young age, Larry was fascinated by machines, algorithms, and the idea that computers could help people understand complex systems. Sergey Brin, born in 1973 in Moscow, immigrated to the United States as a child. His family had a strong scientific background, and Sergey's curiosity about technology and patterns in data matched Larry's. The two met at Stanford in 1995. Initially, they were rivals in a graduate program focused on computer science, but soon they discovered a shared obsession: the web. They marveled at its potential and recognized its flaws. The problem was simple but profound. How could someone find the right information among millions of web pages? Traditional search engines ranked pages largely by how often keywords appeared, but this approach ignored the true value of content. Some pages were popular, authoritative, and trustworthy. Others were empty or misleading. Larry and Sergey asked a radical question. What if a page's importance could be measured by the number and quality of links pointing to it? In other words, the web itself could act as a map of authority. Pages that were cited frequently by other credible pages must be valuable. Pages ignored by the rest of the web could be ranked lower. This idea became the foundation for a revolutionary algorithm they called PageRank. It was elegant, mathematical, and powerful. Instead of just counting keywords, PageRank evaluated the web as a network, analyzing relationships between pages to determine their true importance. By 1996, Larry and Sergey had built a working prototype of a search engine in their Stanford dorm rooms. They initially called it Backrub because the system analyzed backlinks to measure a page's authority. Backrub ran on borrowed computers and servers housed in their dorm basement. It was crude but effective. The results were astonishing. Pages that previously would have been buried in search results now appeared at the top. The engine returned more relevant results than any other system in existence. Larry and Sergey realized they had stumbled upon something far bigger than a school project. In 1997, they registered a new domain name, Google.com. The name was a play on Google, the mathematical term for 1 followed by 100 zeros, a fitting metaphor for the massive amount of information the web contained. Even as students, they were ambitious. They wanted Google to organize all the world's information and make it universally accessible. But turning a brilliant idea into a functioning company was far from easy. Funding was scarce. Investors were skeptical. The internet bubble was still forming, and many believed search engines were niche tools without long-term potential. Undeterred, Larry and Sergey persisted, running Google from their dorm room and later from a garage in Menlo Park, California. Their breakthrough came in 1998 when Andi Bechtolsheim, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, wrote a check for $100,000 after seeing their prototype. That investment gave Larry and Sergey the means to hire staff, rent office space, and scale the search engine. Google's growth was rapid.
Unlike other search engines of the time, which cluttered their pages with ads, banners, and links to other services, Google remained clean, fast, and focused entirely on delivering relevant results. The simplicity of the interface was part of its genius. Users could type queries and get answers instantly. But technology alone wasn't enough. Google also innovated behind the scenes. They built a distributed network of servers to handle the massive computational demands of crawling and indexing the web. They developed algorithms to combat spam and improve relevance. Every step from coding to infrastructure was designed to make the user experience faster, smarter, and more reliable. By 2000, Google introduced AdWords, a simple advertising system that allowed businesses to pay for placement in search results. This innovation funded the company without compromising the user experience. Suddenly, Google was not just a search engine, it was a sustainable, profitable company. The impact was immediate. People no longer had to sift through unreliable search results or rely on slow directories. Students could research faster. Businesses could reach customers instantly. News traveled quicker. Ideas spread more efficiently. Google had created the world's most powerful information tool. Over the next decade, Google expanded rapidly. Gmail, Google Maps, Google Scholar, and other products extended the company's influence into email, navigation, and research. The search engine remained at the core, but the company's vision continued to grow. Beyond technology, Google also shaped culture. It defined how people approached knowledge. Googling became a verb embedded in daily life. People expected information to be instant, relevant, and trustworthy. Education, work, and leisure were transformed. Larry Page and Sergey Brin's innovation was not just about computers, it was about human behavior. They had recognized that information alone is meaningless without accessibility, organization, and relevance. By creating algorithms that understood the relationships between ideas, they fundamentally changed how humans interact with knowledge. Google's influence extended globally. By the 2010s, billions of people around the world relied on it daily. It became the starting point for learning, shopping, researching, and even social interaction. Governments, businesses, and individuals all adapted to a new reality. Information was now instantly searchable and universally available. The story of Google is also a story about the American dream. Two students, armed with curiosity, intelligence, and persistence, created something that reshaped the global economy and human culture. They started with nothing but a vision and a garage, challenging established companies, overcoming skepticism, and building a new way for humanity to connect with knowledge. Today, Google continues to innovate from artificial intelligence to self-driving cars, cloud computing, and beyond. But the heart of the company remains the same: organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible. Larry Page and Sergey Brin did more than launch a search engine. They launched a revolution in human communication and understanding. They showed the power of code, curiosity, and collaboration. And every time someone types a question into a search box, the world witnesses the lasting legacy of two students who changed how humans find and use information, forever altering the way we live, work, and think.
Imagine navigating a busy city without a map, finding your way across unfamiliar streets without guidance, or trying to track a package without knowing its location. For most people today, these tasks are effortless. We pull out our phones, tap a screen, and instantly know exactly where we are, how to get where we want, and when we'll arrive. But this wasn't always possible. The story of how the Global Positioning System, or GPS, came to be is a story of military innovation, Cold War urgency, technological brilliance, and a chain of ideas that transformed daily life across the globe. It begins in the early 1960s. The United States was in the middle of the Cold War, a tense standoff with the Soviet Union. Global surveillance, missile accuracy, and navigation had suddenly become national security issues. If America's military could not pinpoint locations on land, at sea, or in the air with precision, the consequences could be catastrophic. The idea of satellites was still new. The first successful American satellite, Explorer 1, had launched in 1958. Soon, military leaders realized that satellites could do more than gather intelligence. They could also help navigate. Traditional navigation relied on compasses, maps, and stars, which were limited, slow, and vulnerable to errors. In 1960, the U.S. Navy launched the Transit Program, also known as NavSat, the first operational satellite navigation system. Originally designed to guide submarines carrying nuclear missiles, Transit allowed naval vessels to determine their position using signals from satellites in orbit. The system was revolutionary, but it had limitations. It required waiting for satellites to pass overhead, and positioning updates could be delayed by hours. Engineers knew the technology could go further. They envisioned a system that provided continuous, global, real-time location data. In 1973, the U.S. Department of Defense officially began the GPS program, known as Navstar. The goal was ambitious: a network of satellites in orbit that could provide precise positioning anywhere on Earth, day or night, regardless of weather conditions. Developing GPS was a monumental challenge. Satellites had to be designed to last for years in harsh space conditions. Signals had to travel across tens of thousands of miles with extreme accuracy. Ground stations needed to track satellites and correct errors caused by the atmosphere, clock drift, and orbital variations. The mathematics alone was staggering, requiring breakthroughs in orbital mechanics, atomic clocks, and signal processing. One of the key innovations was the use of atomic clocks. Unlike ordinary clocks, atomic clocks are precise to billionths of a second. GPS satellites transmit time-stamped signals, and receivers calculate their exact position based on the time it takes for the signals to reach Earth. Without this precision, the system would be useless. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the first prototypes were in orbit, and military applications expanded rapidly. Pilots could navigate with unprecedented accuracy. Ships and submarines could determine their positions in real time. Troop movements, missile targeting, and reconnaissance all became far more precise. GPS gave the U.S. military a strategic advantage unlike anything before. But the story of GPS isn't only about war. The turning point for civilian life came in 1983 after a tragic accident. A Korean Airlines passenger jet, Flight 007, strayed into Soviet airspace and was shot down. In response, President Ronald Reagan announced that GPS would be made available for civilian use once the system was fully operational, albeit with limited precision at first. The world would eventually gain access to the technology that had once been a military secret. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, GPS infrastructure expanded. By 1995, the Navstar constellation of 24 satellites was fully operational. Accuracy improved dramatically, from tens of meters to just a few meters for civilians. The system was global, continuous, and reliable. With GPS available to the public, a technological revolution began. Transportation changed forever. Drivers could navigate unfamiliar cities without paper maps. Shipping companies could track cargo across continents. Airlines optimized flight paths, saving fuel and time. The logistics industry was transformed. Personal electronics soon followed. Early handheld GPS units allowed hikers, sailors, and outdoor enthusiasts to explore safely. Then came the smartphone revolution. By the late 2000s, GPS was integrated into every phone. Apps like Google Maps, Waze, and Uber depended entirely on satellite positioning. Suddenly, the world could be mapped, measured, and navigated in real time. GPS also transformed emergency services. Police, firefighters, and paramedics could locate people quickly, saving countless lives. Disaster response improved. Search and rescue became faster and more effective. Even agriculture benefited, with GPS-guided tractors optimizing planting and harvesting. The system's influence extended into finance and communication.
GPS timing signals synchronize financial transactions, cellular networks, and power grids. Without GPS, modern banking, telecommunications, and energy infrastructure would be far less efficient. Despite all these applications, the core principles remain the same as in the military's original design: satellites in precise orbits, atomic clocks, and triangulation of signals. What began as a Cold War project for national defense evolved into a foundation of modern civilization. The story of GPS is also a story of American innovation and collaboration. It involved government agencies, military planners, private contractors, engineers, mathematicians, and scientists. Each contribution, from orbital calculations to atomic clocks to miniaturized receivers, was crucial. The system continues to evolve. Modern GPS now works alongside other satellite navigation systems, like Europe's Galileo, Russia's GLONASS, and China's Beidou. Advances in signal accuracy, integration with artificial intelligence, and miniaturization continue to make GPS smarter, faster, and more reliable. Every time a driver taps their phone for directions, every time an airline adjusts its flight path, every time a runner tracks a jog with a smartwatch, the legacy of that military project lives on. GPS has become essential to everyday life, even though most people never think about it. From submarines and missiles to smartphones and self-driving cars, GPS proves the power of American ingenuity. What began as a classified military project has transformed travel, communication, commerce, and culture. It connected the world in ways that were unimaginable 50 years ago. In the end, GPS is more than technology. It is a symbol of what humans can achieve when curiosity, expertise, and necessity intersect. It reminds us that behind every device in our pockets, every route we take, every delivery that arrives on time, lies decades of vision, experimentation, and perseverance. What started as a way to locate submarines now helps humanity navigate the Earth itself, and it all began with satellites, code, and the bold idea that precision in space could transform life on the ground. GPS didn't just change travel, it changed how we live, work, communicate, and explore. It turned time and distance into measurable quantities. It turned the invisible world of satellites into something essential for daily life. And that is how one American military project became a global tool, changing travel, phones, industries, and the very way humans navigate their world.